Essential Questions and Elements of Poetry. This is an instructional vodcast for a poetry unit for 5th grade students. In our study of poetry, there are a few essential questions I would like for you to think about. What is poetry? Is poetry useful in our modern society? Are certain poetic forms better than others? What qualities make good poetry and/or bad poetry? Who should judge the poetry we write? Who writes good poetry? Some other questions I would like for you to ponder. Are 5th graders able to compose worthwhile poetry? Should curriculum topics be integrated with poetry writing? What produces better poetry, working alone or collaboration with others? What makes a poem better than another? Let's look at some sources and how they describe poetry. The Merriam-Webster definition for poetry is writing that formulates a concentrated, imaginative awareness of experience in language, chosen and arranged to create a specific emotional response through meaning, sound, and rhythm. Wikipedia describes poetry as a form of literary art in which language is used for its aesthetic, and evocative qualities, in addition to or in lieu of its apparent meaning. What's your definition of poetry? Let's try an activity to create a simple poem in our minds. We'll revisit this later in class. Think of one of the following emotions: sad, mad, or happy. Now think in your mind, when do I feel that emotion? Why do I feel that emotion? How does it feel to be that emotion? Emotion is very important in poetry, but there's also a lot of elements that poets use to create their masterpieces. One of the elements poets can use is rhythm, which means to flow. In poetry, the flowing quality refers to the movement of words in a poem. Why do poets use rhythm? For many reasons. One, they can increase the enjoyment in hearing language. To highlight and emphasize specific words in a poem, to create dramatic effects, or to suggest mood. For example, a rapid rhythm can suggest excitement and involvement, and a slow, leisurely rhythm can suggest laziness or contemplation. Besides rhythm, there are some other elements of poetry, including rhyme and sound patterns. Sound is an important part and the pleasure of poetry. One of the ways in which poets can emphasize sound is with rhyme. Some poets create their own words to create humorous rhyming effects. For example, ooze and slews, thickier and sickier. Those are different ways that sound can add to your poems. There's also alliteration, which means the repetition of initial consonants or groups of consonants to create sound patterns. And a lot of times when alliteration happens, tongue twisters occur. For example, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Did Peter Piper pick a peck of pickled peppers? If Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, where's the peck of pickled peppers Peter Piper picked? If you say that a few times, your tongue might twist around. The other classic tongue twister many of you know about, she sells seashells by the seashore. The shells she sells are surely seashells. So if she sells shells on the seashore, I'm sure she sells seashore shells. Yes, Miss Malloy is having tongue twister issues. So those are some examples and ways that you can use sound and alliteration in your poetry. Poets also can use repetition in their poems. Poets use repetition to enrich or emphasize words, phrases, lines, or even whole verses in poems. There are many times you come across a poem where they repeat the same words over and over and over. If it's a delicious soup, soup, oh my, soup, soup, the constant repetition will help emphasize what the poet is trying to emphasize in some kind of feeling about the soup. Imagery is another important aspect to poetry, and it's actually one of the primary elements. It encourages children to see, hear, feel, taste, smell, and touch the worlds created by poets. Imagery ties back to the feelings and how somebody can create a picture in their heads for what the poets write on paper. You will also find that figurative language is used a lot in poetry. It's used to clarify, add vividness, and encourages readers to experience language in new ways. There are a few different types of figurative language. One is a metaphor, which is an implied comparison between things that have something in common. For example, the streets were a furnace, the sun an executioner. Well, the sun isn't really an executioner. However, the streets were so hot that it felt like the sun was. A simile is a direct comparison between things that have something in common but are essentially different. For example, as brave as a lion, as rich as gold. Last night, Bob slept like a log. When we look at last night Bob slept like a log, Bob isn't really a log, but he was as still and stationary as a log would be. Personification is another element that poets can use. Giving human emotions and characteristics to inanimate objects, abstract ideas, and non-human things. For example, if I wrote a poem about a bird and how the bird wrapped up her baby in a warm embrace. Do birds really wrap up their babies in warm embraces? No, but the use of personification creates that imagery that they can. Hyperbole is an exaggeration that creates specific effects. For example, the waffle is so tough that it cannot be dented by a hacksaw. Could a waffle be so tough that it's really, you couldn't cut it with a hacksaw? Probably not true. Unless you left it outside maybe for 100 years, I don't know. But I'm sure the birds might eat it by then. There's also an element of shape. Poets can create and take the shape of their subject or any other shape that adds meaning or emotion to the poem. A lot of times you've seen with Shel Silverstein, he does many different types of shapes and writes his poems using shape to add to the meaning and the feeling of what he's trying to express. You will have your own opportunity to use some of these nifty poetry elements when you write your own poetry over the next few weeks. And there are many aspects to good poetry, but finding what works for you with your own unique style is what will create your original masterpieces.